If we could ask everyone to take their seats, please. Hearing will come to order. Today's hearing concerns one of the most basic responsibilities of the Oversight Committee, eliminating wasteful spending and fraud in the Federal Government. Yesterday's release of the latest GAO high-risk list presents an occasion to renew our focus on this priority and look forward to hearing from the United States Comptroller, Mr. Dodaro, not only about the positive results and developments, but about the continuing struggle that affects 83% of all executive branch spending. There really is no celebration for good news possible where we have a $1.6 trillion deficit. But every dollar saved through elimination of waste, fraud, abuse of any sort that costs the American taxpayer money should be applauded, encouraged, and, as they say in Las Vegas, doubled down on. It is my intention to work closely with the GAO and watchdog groups in the days and weeks to come to ensure that the House and the Senate do everything possible to have the good news we will hear about today and the challenges that remain ahead be, in fact, our highest priority. With deference to all the other members who are returning, I would ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in order to place their opening statements in the record without objection. The Chair now would like to swear in the first panel, and let me go to that part. You know, it's probably easier not to rise. I'll just make sure I say it correctly. Okay, my committee staff is swearing that we need to rise. I saw it seated yesterday, so I knew it could be done. That's better. Thank you. Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give to this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect that all members of the panel answered yes. Please be seated. Now, you may feel like the first panel, but my talking points say I'm recognizing the second panel because of the Senator. So it's my pleasure to introduce the Honorable Gene Dodaro, who is the Comptroller of the United States. Ms. Deborah Carmer-Hines, who is Vice President and Partner of IBM Public Sector. Mr. Vincent Flakes, who is the Federal Policy Director at the Center for Health Transformation. And Dr. DeRuby is the Senior Research Fellow at Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Welcome, and General, Comptroller General, you've done this so many times, so it will be for anyone who hasn't. Your entire written statements will be placed in the record. The goal of your opening statement is not to read it in its totality, but to use the 5 minutes in a way to enhance or augment. We will not stop you exactly at 5 minutes, but when it turns red, please find a way to wrap up your oral statements. With that, we recognize the Comptroller General for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you, Ranking Member Cummings, all the members of the committee. I'd like to commend you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing in the committee. It is a good opportunity for us to discuss our high-risk list that we keep updated and unveil at the beginning of each new Congress to help set the oversight agenda, not only for the Congress, but also to give the administration a roadmap as well as to what areas they should be working diligently on. The 30 areas that we have on the high-risk list right now represent tremendous opportunities to save billions of dollars, and if actions are taken appropriately to improve the performance and accountability of the Federal Government for the benefit of the American people. So they represent tremendous opportunities. I'll highlight a few areas that I think, apropos this hearing, will be of interest, and then be happy to talk about any of the areas. First, there are the Medicare and Medicaid programs. These are complex programs that are highly susceptible to billions of dollars in improper payments. When we first put these programs on the high-risk list, there really were no measures of improper payments. And thanks to legislation and administrative initiatives, now there are estimates of the amount of improper payments, but the work is just beginning. There's a long way to go to bring these improper payments and the billions of dollars under control and to really provide the type of accountability. A lot will depend on how successful agencies are in implementing the new Improper Payments Elimination and Recovery Act, which this committee sponsored and supported. And as you know, that act introduces a lot more rigor into the statistical nature of the estimates. It lowers the thresholds to make sure more things are reported appropriately. It requires corrective actions and identification of the causes of the improper payments, more rigorous reporting, accountability to be fixed, and it will also require recovery of those monies where it's appropriate and possible to make the recovery. So this legislation has a lot of potential, and I would respectfully recommend that the committee figure out a way, and I think it's already in your plans, in your oversight plans, to make sure you follow up on how agencies are implementing this improper payments legislation. In some areas, like the Medicare Part D prescription drug part of Medicare, there is not even an estimate yet. So the estimates that are being made to date aren't yet complete. So this has tremendous potential, and we'd be happy to work with you in doing this. It also has potential cross-government. Second area has to do with unused Federal property. And as we know, and has been reported, in 2009, the Federal agencies identified over 45,000 buildings, Federal buildings, that are either not being used or being underutilized. And the government is incurring an annual operating cost for these buildings of about $1.7 billion a year. Clearly, there's a need to move forward and to dispose of these buildings properly, eliminate this unnecessary operating cost. There's also costly leasing opportunities that could be revisited as well. So that's another target. Also, in DoD weapons systems acquisition, as Senator McCaskill mentioned, the Congress passed the Weapons Systems Acquisition Reform Act in 2009, and that included a lot of important reforms to come up with better cost estimates and also better accountability in terms of reporting on those areas. But our reviews of the weapons systems portfolios have shown billions of dollars in cost growth in those activities and longer periods of time to deliver the weapons system. So it's costing a lot more than originally expected, and it's delaying the implementation of this. We've made a number of recommendations to better prioritize the weapons systems portfolios, to put in more diligent business practices and business cases, technology maturity levels before investments are made, and also to make sure that there's proper oversight and control over that whole process. As Senator McCaskill also mentioned, there are a wide range of other DoD business practices, whether they be in the logistics support, contract management, and other areas that are also on the high-risk list that provide opportunities for more improvement, streamlining, and eliminating of the government's costs. The bottom line is, Mr. Chairman, there are tremendous opportunities out there for correcting these high-risk problems that we've identified. Agencies are working on it. I'm pleased to report that we've had a series of meetings with OMB and the agencies on the high-risk list and GAO to talk about more specific actions that need to be taken. to come off this list. Congressional oversight is important. The only areas that we've taken off the list have been ones where the Congress has been diligent in conducting oversight. The two we took off this year, over a dozen congressional hearings were held on both the census area and the DOD personnel security clearance area since the time we put them on the list to them coming off the list. And so it's a major factor, but you need also top-level agency commitment on the part of the administration. I can assure you that it's going to be a top priority at the GAO to continue to focus on these activities and to do what we can to try to help be specific, maintain our independence. We're not going to take anything off the list until it's deserved to be taken off the list. But our goal is to try to provide as much specificity as we can to how to get these problems fixed and remedied. We can't afford anymore to have these problems continue. So thank you very much, and I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you. Ms. Carmer? Ma'am, is it Kammer?
It's Kammer.
Kammer. Okay. I'll try to keep it correct. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to appear before you today to discuss how the IBM Corporation believes that Federal agencies can improve their efficiency and reduce costs through the application of commercial best practices. My name is Deborah Kammer Hines, and I am the Public Sector Consulting Leader for IBM in North America. In that role, I oversee all of IBM's consulting activities at the Federal, state, and local level. Prior to becoming a management consultant, I worked as a Federal credit policy analyst at the Office of Management and Budget. In this role, I performed budgetary, credit, economic, and policy analysis in the review of credit programs across the Federal Government. We recently authored a report entitled Strategies to Cut Costs and Improve Performance. The purpose of this report was to help advance the ongoing national dialogue about our Federal fiscal crisis by offering 7 specific initiatives where technology-enabled productivity solutions can make a material difference in the performance of Federal programs. These 7 initiatives include: 1, consolidate information technology infrastructure; 2, streamline government supply chains; 3, reduce energy use; 4, move to shared services for mission support activities; 5, apply advanced business analytics to reduce improper payments; 6, reduce field operations footprint and move to electronic self-service; and 7, monetize the government's assets. We estimate that the aggressive implementation of these 7 initiatives can generate $1 trillion in savings over 10 years. These savings would be generated through improved performance rather than through program reductions or tax increases. Federal agencies, and state and local governments for that matter, spend a great deal of energy collecting and dispersing funds. They collect taxes and fees from citizens and businesses, and they disperse funds to organizations and individuals through a wide variety of programs. These activities generate large volumes of transactions, and as a consequence, they are vulnerable to both honest mistakes in administration as well as intentional efforts to defraud. The good news for governments at all levels is that these types of programs lend themselves to what we call predictive analytics. So to put it simply, predictive analytics is a collection of statistical techniques that, when applied to a large number of transactions being processed through a standard business process, can reveal patterns that are indications of fraud, abuse, or simply poor management. Several Federal agencies apply predictive analytics today, most notably the IRS and the Department of Health and Human Services. However, we believe that deeper investment in these techniques and the broader applications of the lessons that have been learned in private sector settings can improve the performance of these efforts and yield significant new savings. Let me describe one example of how the application of these types of tools is already generating real results. The State of New York hired IBM after the state's tax department estimated it was losing $1 billion annually in improper tax refunds. IBM built a predictive model that scores every refund request on the likelihood that it was valid. The 4% of returns deemed the most questionable were rejected outright. Investigators examined others considered high risk to decide whether or not they were valid. And over the last 6 years, the state has denied $1.2 billion in improper refunds, even taking into account the successful appeals. Today, the state continues to run the program on its own, and we have similar programs with other states and local governments that I'd be glad to share. It is important to note that many federal agencies are focused on these issues and are making important strides. OMB, for example, should be applauded for working in partnerships with the state, federal agencies, and others to identify innovative ways to reduce improper payments, improve administrative efficiency, enhance service delivery, and reduce access barriers to federally funded, state-administered benefits programs. More can and should be done. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Frakes?
Thank you. Chairman Issa, Congressman Cummings, and member of the committee, thank you for holding this hearing today and inviting me to participate. My name is Vincent Frakes, and I am the Federal Policy Director at the Center for Health Transformation. Decreasing and hopefully eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse in our healthcare system is vital to improving the quality of care and lowering healthcare costs. The Center for Health Transformation has worked extensively on these issues and with many of our members to find solutions to this dilemma. Fraud and abuse places a massive burden on government and consequently on American taxpayers. On Monday, President Obama released his budget for the upcoming year. In his budget, the President noted that the gross federal debt will exceed $15 trillion this year, which is equal to the size of the entire U.S. economy. This is unsustainable. A recent Thomson Reuters study found that between $600 billion and $850 billion of healthcare spending annually is wasted, and up to $175 billion of that is in pure fraud. Fraudulent and wasteful spending is low-hanging fruit that can and should be used to reduce this debt. There is broad bipartisan consensus that fraud and abuse within Medicare and Medicaid must be addressed and can make a significant dent in our nation's government spending. Unfortunately, little has been done to curb these harmful practices. Outright criminality imposes the largest and most high-profile burden on this system. Crooks have figured out how to game the system, and they must be stopped. Take, for example, an Orange County, California cancer doctor who was charged in April of last year with fraudulently billing Medicare and health insurance companies close to $1 million for administering injectable cancer medications that were never provided. Or the Miami area clinic consultant who was convicted last May of healthcare fraud in connection with a $5.8 million Medicare scheme in which the clinic was falsely claiming to administer HIV injection and infusion treatments. Countless examples of these types of fraud exist around the country, and their practice must be eliminated. Doing so could save the government and the American taxpayers more than $1 trillion over the next 10 years. Unfortunately, the vast majority of these crimes go undetected. Medicare and Medicaid are designated as quote-unquote high-risk programs by the GAO, and their improper payment rate exceeds 10%. Compare that to the less than 0.1% fraud rate that exists in the credit card industry, which conducts more than $2 trillion annually in transactions and has nearly 1 billion credit cards in circulation. The primary reason for this success is utilizing real-time technology that pre-screens payments before they go out the door. CMS would be wise to learn from these private sector successes. There are 3 concrete solutions that can be taken immediately to improve Medicare and Medicaid and begin to solve the fiscal crisis that we find in ourselves with these programs. First, we must incorporate private sector solutions to identify, monitor, and ultimately prevent fraud and abuse. Companies like Humetrics and NCN are on the front lines of utilizing data tracking models to head off fraud and errors on the front end in order to save the private and public payers significant amounts of money on the back end. There is no reason that these same systems can't be utilized at the federal level as well. Second, we must introduce significant changes to the current system of electronic data tracking and data sharing across jurisdictions and departments. That includes utilizing a single unified depository of information to reduce wasted resources that are expended on cross-referencing potential crooks. Real-time data tracking can identify irregularities at a moment's notice across state and provider venues. Third, we must institute a comprehensive and transparent model of supplier approval and fraudulent claims administration, as well as encourage the implementation of more intelligent systems and schemes to reduce waste and fraud in the system. There are many more steps that can be taken, as my written testimony explores, but these are first and foremost in terms of importance. Not only do we need to aggressively attack the roots of fraud and abuse in the system, but we also need to solve the primary reason for waste, and that is defensive medicine. One major reason that providers order unnecessary services is due to the fear of potential legal action. Predatory litigators cause physicians to practice defensive medicine ordering far more tests and providing far more services and procedures that are necessary. This drives the cost through the roof. Jackson Healthcare and Gallup recently released a poll of physicians where physicians said that more than a quarter of all healthcare services that they deliver, more than $600 billion a year, are unnecessary and delivered solely to reduce their liability risks. Congressman Gingrey, Lamar Smith, and David Scott recently introduced H.R. 5, the Health Act, which you co-sponsored, Mr. Chairman, and as did other members of this committee, that includes meaningful medical liability reforms while strengthening the doctor-patient relationship. This reform is a critical step to eliminating defensive medicine, lowering costs, and expanding access to care. Waste, fraud, and abuse run rampant in our nation's healthcare system, but with fundamental changes in how government uses technology, properly screens providers, involves law enforcement, and incorporates legal reform, we can save trillions of dollars and fundamentally transform our healthcare system to one that delivers more choices of better quality at a lower cost for every American. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Dr. DeRashid.
Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, distinguished member of this committee, thank you for the opportunity to come before you today to testify. My name is Véronique de Rugy. I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where I study tax and budget issues. Fraud, waste, and abuse are indeed problems worthy of congressional attention. However, the $125 billion in overt waste that comes from improper payment pales in comparison to the waste that exists in current congressional spending patterns and the economic damage caused by the misallocation of capital and the creation of perverse incentives. First, this waste occurs when the federal government spends money on private sector functions. Having the government runs businesses such as Amtrak and oversee infrastructure such as the air traffic control system is not just inefficient. It also hinders economic growth and costs the taxpayers money while providing low-quality service to customers. Second, this waste also occurs when the federal government spends money on functions in the purview of the states. President Reagan wrote that federalism is rooted in the knowledge that our political liberties are best assured by limiting the size and scope of the national government. Sadly, Congress has ignored this advice and is now spending $500 billion in grants to states for activity that it has no legal or practical reason to be involved in, such as healthy marriage promotion and museum professional training grants. It is inefficient and creates an unacceptable lack of accountability. The waste also occurs because when lawmakers are busy running state, local, and private affairs, they have less time to oversee federal agencies and focus on critical national issues such as defense and security. But the largest and most recent example of wasteful federal spending occurred under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Much of the money in the bill was spent, and yet unemployment hovers around 9%, higher than the 8.8% unemployment rate that the administration threatened the country would face if Congress did not pass the gigantic stimulus bill. Evidence like this just confirmed what many scholars had predicted all along. Government spending can't jumpstart an economy. As a result, many have concluded that the stimulus package was a waste. The practical realities witnessed by the American taxpayers bear out the academic truth. The stimulus spending did not deliver on the promises made. Unemployment remains high, and it has saddled the country with more debt. What would increase employment and stimulate economic growth is investment, private investment, not government spending labeled as investment. But the American companies are not investing their capital, and some $1.8 trillion in capital is sitting on the sideline. Why? Because entrepreneurs and risk takers are acting very cautiously out of fear of the future. Economists and the business community agree recent policy change have hampered business investment, making a bad situation worse. The prospect of endless future debt and deficit raises the threat of increased taxes and government crowding out capital markets. Uncertainty prevails. As a result, U.S. companies don't build new plants, they don't conduct research, and they don't hire people. People stay unemployed for weeks, months, years. You are the representative of the American taxpayers. You are the stewards of the nation's finances. You want the economy to grow. You want people to be employed. Then you must realize that the federal government cannot be and should not be the solution to every one of our problems. There are things that only the federal government can do. But when the federal government gets involved where it shouldn't be, it wastes capital, time, and taxpayers' money. Understanding this will guide you in making hard decisions about where to cut spending. However, it also means that you must put all spending on the table. Congress needs to make sure that no area of the budget are untouchable, not entitlement, not defense spending. All part of the budget must be on the table for review and potential cuts. Finally, you need to put in place now serious, strict, and unavoidable budget rules that ties Congress's hand and restore fiscal discipline. With such reform, the American people will start having confidence in their future again. The country will be on the road to recovery and prosperity. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
I first want to thank all of you for being very, very close to that 5-minute. That's pretty close to a record. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. You each gave a different perspective. In 5 minutes, it's going to be hard to go through all of them, but I'm going to start with Mr. Frakes. When you gave those numbers, one of the things that I found interesting was you went through defensive medicine as a major part, and that's beyond the scope, perhaps, of this committee. Other committees will be dealing with it. But when you looked at the $178 billion in outright payments for either procedures that didn't occur or even in some cases to entities that weren't even what they claimed to be, what do you believe, or has your organization studied what you believe it would cost the Federal Government to avoid all or part of that? Where's the sweet spot? Would $1 billion in a system to attack that kind of waste or that kind of false payments yield far more than $1 billion?
Certainly. We've seen it through the private sector, through IBM and others, that if you put in money on the front end, it will yield significant results and much greater results on the back end. When I'm talking about putting in money at the front to really curb this idea of stopping suppliers and checking things before they go out the door, you're going to see a massive increase in the number of drops in numbers of fraudulent payments, fraudulent suppliers that exist, to the tune of, if anything, if you put in $1 billion, you're going to see a much higher yield. Those numbers are not insignificant, and they're going to be incredibly influential in terms of cutting things off. There's this thought out there that if you apply to be a Medicare or a Medicaid supplier, that you are automatically granted that, and that's simply not the case. We need to be doing a much better job of putting in front end money that will yield much higher savings as a result of cutting off fraudulent suppliers and so forth.
Controller Dodaro, you're familiar with the recovery organization's efforts, their website and their database management. My understanding is that was a couple of $1 million, and they have found, like $80 million in one example only of what would have been the losses through Medicare fraud, in which the organizations that were doing it had actually stolen other doctors' identification and so on. Can you comment a little bit on how do we get from you and other watchdog organizations, how do we get the numbers so that we can find a way to fund programs similar to Chairman Devaney's?
Yeah, I would be happy to provide some additional details, but what I would say is that I agree completely that an upfront investment targeting certain areas that that have high rates of issues like home health services, for example, and other areas to put controls in up front would be a very appropriate investment to be made. We've made recommendations along those lines. We're looking at prepayment controls right now.
But prepayment controls are a big step. That's sort of back to that $80 billion that we can't seem to get well spent in IT expenditures. One of my real question here, and why I picked out that 100, anyway, there are all kinds of numbers. In fairness, I've seen it as low as $70 billion, just a rounding error, I guess, all the way up to approaching $200 billion in payments made in Medicare for services not provided, or in many cases provided to entities that were not even what they said they were. How do we attack that in a way and I'm specifically looking at Earl Devaney's work, because that wasn't even in his main target, but because stimulus funds were used there, he was able to stand up, and I believe it was less than $2 million, and he's already headed off a scam that was just anecdotal analysis. How do we get, with GAO's help, hopefully, the ability for this committee to make a case to Congress at a time in which it seems like we're cutting, to make, and perhaps that $2 million is enough, but to make that kind of investment and then score the savings so that if we spend $5 million to save $500 million, we then see the opportunity to spend 10 times that to save 10 times that.
Yes, no, I understand what you're saying, and I agree with that. I mean, we can work with Earl. I think that we're going to try to use his system in the healthcare area and on an experimental basis, and to try to come up with some proposals for that detection kind of capability up front with the relationships between different entities and the screening that was done. So we'd be happy to try to come up with a proposal that we could discuss with you.
Yep. Ms. Kammer, if I could just ask you one question as the private sector representative here. If we were able to score it, do you believe the private sector, the way they have in the past with the IRS, would you believe private sector would be interested in working on, if you will, a bounty system, one in which it costs nothing to the government unless we save many times that?
Yeah, so what you're talking about is an example of what we did with the state of North Carolina that we're operating right now with their Medicare and Medicaid payments. And so we have implemented that.
And my time is excited, so just briefly, what have you saved?
Yeah, so it's an outcome-based approach, and we have so that has just started, and we have identified opportunities for them to go after that. And I don't have the number right in front of me, but I believe it's in my written testimony.
But you only get a small part of whatever
We
they
get
claim.
10% of what gets identified, yeah.
Thank you. I recognize the gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And all of your testimony is fascinating and is so very, very important. First of all, let me go back, Mr. Dodaro, to something that Senator McCaskill was talking about. You were here when she was testifying. You'll recall that she said, basically, don't cut your nose off to spite your face with regard to funding for agencies like yours. Are you satisfied with the funding that you have to do your job? You're going to have to answer that quickly, unfortunately, because I got a lot of questions.
Yes, no. Yeah. Basically, I've requested, given the fiscal situation in the country, that our funding level be kept flat at 2010 fiscal year levels, and I'd be satisfied if our funding was kept at that level.
Thank you. Another question is, during your testimony, you talked about the folks that the agencies that you were able to take off the list, and you said that it seemed that you saw something very interesting, and that they seem to have come under the most scrutiny by the Congress. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, there was sustained congressional attention in both of those areas.
And Mr. Chairman, that what he just said, I think, is so crucial. We saw that with regard to the Coast Guard. When we stayed on top of them, we got it done, and got it done in a little bit of time, saving millions of dollars in a short period of time, because there was that sustained effort. Federal contracting has expanded over the last 10 years and to over $500 billion. According to your report, GAO has included the Defense Department's contract management on the high-risk list since 1992. DoD weapon systems acquisition and supply chain management have been on the list even longer, since 1990. Mr. Dodaro, is anyone able to quantify how much of DoD's contracting budget over these past 20 years has been lost to waste, fraud, or abuse?
I'm not aware of any estimate of that nature.
And one of the things that made me realize, and I'd said this to the Coast Guard folks, I believe that we were caught up in a culture the Coast Guard was caught up in a culture of mediocrity. And then it made me, when I saw a statement by Secretary Gates, it made me wonder about our Defense Department being caught up in a culture of mediocrity when it comes to these kinds of issues, particularly on contracting out. He says, Secretary Gates said, I can't get a number on how many contractors work for the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Are you surprised by that statement?
No, I'm not.
That's sad, isn't it?
I think that there's plenty of room for improvement in the Defense Department's business areas. For example, they're one of the few and the largest department that has yet been able to get a financial audit and an unqualified opinion. I mean, they're in need of some major reforms and better data in order to manage by.
I'm going to go back to something Ms. Cameron said, and you know, I was saying to my staff that you've done a great advertisement for IBM. And I'm just wondering why, and following up on what the chairman was asking about, is there any way we can incorporate, and is there anything that Congress can do, Mr. Darrow, to incorporate those kinds of things? One of the things that Devaney said to our committee, he said, I want to stop the fraud before it happened. I'll never forget him saying that. And I want to stop the mismanagement before it happens. And I think he's probably done that. So is there any way we can do those kinds of things, the kinds of things that some of our other witnesses talked about from the very beginning? Are you following? And what would it take us to do that? What would we need?
Well, I think you need to have well-developed plans with the agencies. Part of this is changing the culture shift from a pay-and-chase type of an approach. And there was a lot of emphasis on getting the money out the door fast and not always with screening it up front. So changing that cultural shift, putting some additional requirements in place, and well-targeted investments that are developed and tailored to the programs.
Going back to DOD, we have a situation where we've got private contractors, and we saw this in the Coast Guard. You got private contractors being hired to oversee private contractors, which is, again, that goes to that culture of mediocrity. Does that make any sense, and how can we get around that?
That definitely increases the risk. I mean, part of the problem is the contracting amounts of funds at DOD have gone like this. The acquisition workforce has been relatively flat. They haven't adapted to have the right type of oversight. Part of the problem is you can never contract out the government's decisions on what the requirements ought to be in terms, and then providing effective oversight over that area. The lack of definitive requirements is something we see time and time again in changing requirements and not applying good business practices and having a good business case in the beginning before the investments are made or the contracts are let.
I see my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Farenthold.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I had a couple of questions. My first question was, we're talking about billions of dollars in fraud and waste. And I think I know the answer to this question, but I've learned in government it's better to ask the question. When you're scoring the amount of waste, let's say we're writing a check to somebody for $1,000,000.96, and it really should have been $1,000,000,69 or $1,000,000.69. We're counting that as a 27-cent error and not a $1 million error in those numbers, right? I just want to make sure we really are chasing the really big dollars.
Well, I think the amounts that we've mentioned in our report are the right estimate.
Okay, so that's the actual cost to the government and not the aggregate dollar amounts.
Right.
There's some error in.
Yeah, there could be some error in there. And some of the estimates for the Medicare and Medicaid program, for example, some of the improper payments are based upon incomplete documentation, or not having enough documentation. But a lot of it's for medically unnecessary services or people receiving money that are not eligible.
Okay. And I think Medicare and Medicaid is probably a ripe target. And we talk about using software. We have an abysmal record with IT in the Federal Government. I think that comes from the fact we don't try to use off-the-shelf products. We come up with our own, I'm going to use the word ridiculous, specifications rather than trying to squeeze something into an existing product. I realize balancing the Federal budget isn't like going out and buying World of Warcraft at Best Buy. But it seems like, for instance, in Medicare and Medicaid, there ought to be something already developed out there by the private insurance carriers who are doing pretty much the same thing. Do you see some advantage in doing that? And maybe I should direct this to the lady from IBM. I mean, is there a product? I mean, can we just go plug this stuff into your Congos product and just start working at it?
Yes, and so there is I mean, there is a solution. So I don't want to say it's a product. So it's a solution that exists that we have been, like I said, North Carolina. I also want to let you know that CMS has recently issued a request for proposal to do exactly what we're talking about, to do it before it gets paid, to leverage analytics and IT to do predictive analytics around what gets paid.
All right, and I'll yield back the remainder of my time with just the comment that I really think part of what we need to be doing is looking for off-the-shelf solutions we can plug into rather than trying to develop something custom for ourselves. That always tends to be much more expensive. Thank you.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
Mr. Dodaro, one quick question. We haven't asked you to talk about the cyber threat of both dollar waste and failure. Could you comment on that for a moment for all of us? A lot of people are just getting up to speed on that.
Yeah, this is a very important issue. I'm glad you asked me that question. We put computer security across the Federal Government as a high-risk area in 1997 because of concerns that we had. It was the very first time we designated something across the whole Federal Government as high risk. And the risk continued to escalate. And the Federal agencies do not have good comprehensive systems with access controls, segregation of duties, comprehensive security programs. In 2003, we expanded it to critical infrastructure protection, the energy grid and other areas. And the incidents that are occurring and are reported or going higher, the Federal Government needs to have a better public-private partnership with the private sector. Since most of the assets are in the private sector, there needs to be more early warning and detection capabilities. This is a very important area. I was glad to see that the President commissioned the study, but our review of the study shows that of the 24 recommendations, only 2 have been fully implemented to date. So there's a roadmap, clear roles and responsibilities, partnership with the private sector. This is a terribly important area, and we're concerned about it.
Thank you. Does the gentleman yield back?
I do.
The gentleman from New York is recognized. Mr. Yarmouth.
You got me in the wrong state, but that's okay. It's
I'm sorry.
Kentucky, not New York. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry, Kentucky.
I
They
know,
write
you're
it down and
that
I
New
read it.
Yorker
I
covered and
apologize.
everything
Kentucky.
I know everything east of California is all messed up, but that's all right.
No, well, Mr. Kucinich often reminds me I was from Cleveland before I was from California, but the gentleman from Kentucky.
That's quite all right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your testimony, Mr. Dodaro. I wanted to talk with you about one of the categories that you've added to the high-risk list, and that's the revenues from oil and gas leases. According to your report, that is actually one of the largest non-tax income sources of the government, about $9 billion in 2009. And just a couple days ago, you wrote in an op-ed in the New York Times, and you wrote, in fiscal years 2006 and 2007, we found that much of the data reported by oil and gas companies appeared erroneous, resulting in millions in uncollected fees. Do you have any sense of how long the oil and gas companies have been misreporting their production?
I'm not sure offhand, how far back that goes. We did update that work in 2009 and found still continued data inaccuracies in the system. We also looked at Interior's efforts recently to verify the production numbers of oil and gas production and found problems with that as well. The other point I would add on this is that the assessment system generally hasn't been looked at in the last 25 years, and we had made recommendations there because when the Federal Government was compared to other countries and even some states, it was relatively low in terms of what it was charging. Interior has a study underway, and they're due to produce it this year.
Do you have any estimate of how much this may have cost the taxpayers?
Not offhand. Not offhand.
In your examination of the data from 2006 and 2007, what company did you find to have underreported and underpaid the most?
I'm not sure. I'd have to provide that for the record if we have it. I'd be happy to do so.
I'd like to make a request that you would do that and provide a list of the companies that have underreported and therefore underpaid. I appreciate that. Mr. Frakes, I want to just ask you a question. But you made a comment about the amount of medical services provided basically as defensive medicine, and I think you mentioned the number 25%, possibly?
Yes, that's
Where
correct.
did that number come from?
It came from a study that was conducted between Jackson Healthcare and the Gallup organization.
And there are studies that show that that number is considerably lower than that, isn't it? I mean, I think we all agree that there's a lot of service being provided that's probably unjustified, but attributing it to medical malpractice, there are numbers that are considerably lower than that, aren't there?
I guess what we're going off is that study, and the interesting thing about that study was the fact that it was done in private. It was something that was anonymous, so that the physicians felt compelled to answer under under anonymity, and so they were given that cloak. And so we like to think that that number is the most accurate number given that.
I've had doctors stand up in front of a room full of people and admit that they practice defensive medicine, which also is potentially admitting Medicare fraud as well, but they do it anyway. But to pursue that question just a little bit further, would ending the fee-for-service compensation system deal with that issue of medically unnecessary procedures and so forth? Would that help contribute to reducing that number as well?
It certainly would, in the sense that providers would feel the need to move more towards an outcome-based system, and that's something that we at the center talk a lot about, and that is that idea of, as you increase the incentives for outcomes for physicians, not only does the cost go down, but the care goes up, and physicians also would not feel the need as much to practice that level of defensive medicine, certainly.
Yeah. One question, and this is just purely informational, Ms. Kammer, on the issue of the payments going out the door, stopping the payments before they go out the door. One of the complaints that I hear consistently, I'm sure we all do, from medical providers, doctors, hospitals, and so forth, is that they wait a long time for their money to begin with, and because of their assessment, their characterization of being dealing with very low profit margins anyway, that the wait of 90 days or 120 days is already stretching them, pressuring them. How much more delay, or would there be more delay, based on the kind of the theory of approaching payments that you've given us?
We're at the point now through leveraging technology to do predictive analytics that you could get closer to real-time reviews of those, so you could really speed it up.
Could speed it up. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rigi, am I saying it right? Okay. I was really intrigued by what you talked about, and you seem to have a really direct response to what's going on. Now, the President the other day was talking about all this capital that's sitting on the sidelines and businesses aren't investing it, and which leads to the premise that the only way to get out of this situation is for the government to borrow more money and spend more money. Could you expand a little bit on that? Because as a guy right now, I'm an automobile dealer, and I've been encouraged to build another building, and at the point that I have, it's very difficult to borrow money from banks right now for small business people. So while this money is sitting on the sideline, please give me an idea of this philosophy that the government has to just keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing money to get us out of this dilemma. If you could just expand a little bit on your comments, because I think you're hitting right where we need to hear this information.
Thank you. It's a great question. I think I'd like to remind people that the Federal government has already done this, borrow a lot of money and pretended to invest in our economy to jumpstart it, and it has not worked. This money on the sideline is a real direct product of all the uncertainty that is inserted into an economy when the Federal government spends massive amount, because individuals and entrepreneurs are pretty rational, and they understand that spending today or borrowing today means taxes tomorrow. Also, there were a lot of new regulations going in, so it induced a lot of uncertainty, and that is what this money on the sideline is. It's like, why am I going to actually invest money today, hire people, when I don't know what's going to happen? I don't know whether I'm going to have customers. So I think, the uncertainty is the key to everything. And the more the government does what created the uncertainty, the more uncertainty we will have and the less we will recover.
Okay, well, let me ask you, now, this $814 billion stimulus bill, and we describe it as waste, are there any parts of that you thought were worthwhile?
I think it was the part about unemployment benefits. I think, it's as a society, pretty wealthy, we can afford to help people who are deeply in need to some extent. However, I mean, the economic literature was very clear. This was not going to work because while the government invests money, the money has to come from somewhere. There are no magical source for federal funds. It has to be taken from the economy, and it doesn't have the return on investment that the administration claimed it was going to have.
Yeah. And I mean, the whole drive was to spend this money, because if we didn't spend it, we're going to see unemployment rise above 8%, and then so it goes to 10%. And now let me ask you, at some point, people knew this wasn't working. Where could we have said, hey, wait a minute, this is crazy. What are we doing? We're throwing a lot of money out there. We haven't spent it all yet. But then there was this mad rush to spend a lot of money because we said it was going to work, and we continue to see that it's not working, and we're following this Judas goat and saying, yeah, just spend more. We're going to be okay. Borrow more, spend more. At some point, it's going to break for us. Now, at some point, it's going to break, but I don't think it's going to break the right way. It's going to break truly in the sense it is going to break.
I agree with you. I actually would have argued that it was a bad idea to do it in the first place. And there was a lot of evidence. It hasn't worked in the 30s. It hasn't worked in the 70s. And it hasn't worked now. The other thing is, like, it's not only spending in the form of this stimulus bill. It's all the spending that took place in the last 10 years, in the last 20 years, in the last 30 years, right? I mean, there's been a lot of spending. If it worked, we wouldn't be in this mess in the first place. And I think we need to change paths. And we're talking about waste, and we need to realize that waste doesn't just come in the form of overpayment and earmarks. It also comes in the form of the federal government putting its finger everywhere in the private sector where it shouldn't be, to prop companies that are failing, which is a drag on the economy, this propping up those companies, or to give money to companies who are actually succeeding, which is totally useless, like when the federal government gives money to the states and when it shouldn't be. This creates waste. We need to change paths and start thinking directly about what wasting government spending means.
And I appreciate your testimony. I wish we had more time, but I got to tell you, when you add the federal government and then the state and local governments, when we start to talk about how we're attacking our GDP and the amount of money that we're wasting through government, it's way over the top. So thank you for being here today. I really appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We now recognize the are you ready? The gentleman from Cleveland, Ohio, Mr. Kucinich.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Over the past few days, members of this House have voted on amendments to the CR which will severely cut or entirely eliminate government entities or programs which provide critical assistance to the most vulnerable Americans. Some amendments which have already passed eliminate funding for research on some of our nation's most consistently pressing social and economic issues. To my knowledge, none of these existing programs appeared on the GAO's list of government programs at high risk of waste, fraud, and abuse. In the meantime, numerous Department of Defense initiatives, and specifically DoD contracting, rank prominently in the GAO high-risk report as programs that remain very susceptible to fraud and abuse. The report states that there are, quote, significant ongoing problems, unquote, and, quote, persistently poor program outcomes, unquote, in the Department of Defense's inability to perform detailed audits of major defense acquisition programs. It notes that for fiscal year 2009, for example, the DoD obligated $372 billion in contracts for goods and services, and yet that the contracting is hampered by, quote, the lack of well-defined requirements, the use of ill-suited business arrangements, and a lack of an adequate number of trained acquisition and contract oversight personnel, unquote. I have a copy of a letter sent in November of last year by 8 individuals who represent more than 300 years of experience with the Defense Department budget, weapons, and military operations. And, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that a copy of the letter be entered into the
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. This letter was sent to Erskine Bowles, the co-chairman of the President's National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform. These 8 individuals implored Chairman Bowles to take the opportunity to make reform of the Defense Department budget a centerpiece of their effort to create a model for deficit reduction. Quote, the Pentagon cannot track the money it spends. Routinely, DoD does not know if it's paid contractors once, twice, or not at all. We recently learned it does not even know how many contractors it has, how many they employ, and what they're doing, unquote. In sharp contrast to almost every other Federal agency, the Pentagon has failed to comply with the Chief Financial Officers Act of 1990, which sought to solve this problem by requiring the Pentagon and other Federal agencies to pass annual audits of the links between their expenditures and legally enacted appropriations authorizing these expenditures. So, Comptroller General Dodaro, can Congress be sure that budget requests from the Pentagon reflect the Department of Defense's actual costs?
As you mentioned, there's been an inability to have the books of the Pentagon, aside from the Army Corps of Engineers and the
Well, let's
military
talk
health.
about everything else
right.
except the Corps.
Right. They've not been able to pass the test of an audit, so it's not clear, there's accurate accounting of what the expenditures
Isn't
have
it
been.
true that you'd have to be able to audit them to know if their costs roughly match up with their request?
It would be important to have that information as adequate assurance that,
Right.
that the costs were there, yes.
So if we don't have accurate tracking of DOD payments to its contractors, much less how those contractors spent those monies, is it even possible to know if the DOD budget request is being lost to waste, fraud, or other abuse?
Well, there'd be a degree of uncertainty that you wouldn't necessarily want to have in making those kind of judgments. But, basically, the allocations that are made are tracked through budgetary systems that aren't audited either. And I would note that the Department is first now starting to audit the budget numbers that are allocated against the costs. And I think that's a good step and a step in the right direction and should eventually provide the type of assurance that you're looking for.
When I first came to Congress, I was told that the Department of Defense had over 1,100 accounting systems, individual accounting systems, and also that they had over $1 trillion in accounts that they could not track or reconcile. I'm hopeful that those who have the responsibility for oversight of the auditing part will pay attention to that, and hope that you take that message back as well.
I will do that. In fact, of the main reasons we can't provide an opinion on the audited consolidated financial statements of the U.S. government is because of the Department of Defense pervasive financial management practices and procedures. And so we've been trying to work with them. They've got some short-term priorities now to focus on auditing the budget numbers and asset accountability issues, which I think is a good starting point. They have a long way to go.
Well, I'm hopeful, Mr. Chairman, that this committee, as part of its oversight responsibilities, will have the opportunity to go deeply into some of these questions related to the Department of Defense's spending.
Would the gentleman yield?
I certainly would.
I might share with you, when I was in the Army, they during that period of time, they decided they'd find out how many rail cars they had, so they did an audit and came up with about 25% of them missing. Then they did a walk-down audit and found how many had been repainted over the years to company names because they didn't have to explain to the Army or the military that they were missing, but they'd be held to pay if they lost one belonging to a company. So this is not a new problem. I look forward to working with you on solving this long-term problem of a lack of accountability at DOD.
I want to thank the gentleman and hope that his remarks do not imply a favoring of privatization of the Army.
No, but I would like to know if those rail cars have all been found. With that, we recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Ross, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dodaro, thank you for being here very much. I note that last year Congress, when they were raising the debt ceiling, empowered the GAO office for a report as to the duplication of any activities or efforts of the Federal Government that might be cost savings, and that report is forthcoming.
Yes.
Can you give us a preliminary or like a little trailer or sneak preview of what we might anticipate?
Well, what we've identified about 34 different areas of overlap and duplication for consideration by the Congress, and they touch several hundred programs in virtually all Federal departments and agencies. Now, we also, as an added bonus, are including in the report about another 50 cost savings opportunities for the Congress to consider, and also revenue enhancements where there's abilities to tackle what's now an estimated tax gap between taxes owed and collected of about $290 billion.
So could you quantify maybe how much we're looking at in terms of duplication at this point?
We don't have, because of, and we'll discuss in the report, some limitations on, as Congressman Kucinich just talked about, some of the cost data and the baseline information isn't really there. So it's hard to come up with an overall quantification effort, but it'll be billions of dollars. It's significant.
I know we've got limited time here, so this is going to be an interesting question I would love for you to answer, if you could, in the brief time that I have here. In your report on high-risk lists, you indicate strengthening the foundation for efficiency and effectiveness. One of your recommendations is restructuring the U.S. Postal Service to achieve sustainable financial viability. How?
Well, basically, they have to change their business model. The business model they have, and we've outlined options in the report there for the Postal Service to consider and for the Congress as well.
And in that business model, I mean, you've got 150 million households that are being reached every day, 6 days a week so far, by the U.S. Postal Service. But you've got 80% of their cost is for compensation and benefits. I mean, are you suggesting then we look at both sides of the equation, not only the revenue side of the equation, but also the expense side of the equation?
I think everything has to be on the table there to really restructure it. You know, we're looking at facilities. We just put out a report this week talking about how other countries have tackled this problem and reduced their facilities, changed their retail options, changed personnel structures. So I think all things have to be considered.
Okay. Ms. Kammer. And I've got to ask you this question while I'm on the Postal Service because of your background, not only in the public sector, but also in the private sector as a consultant with IBM. Again, you've got an understanding of marketing channels. You've got an understanding of public-private relationships. Would you have any recommendations for the U.S. Postal Service as to how they can be more cost-efficient, cost-effective, more technologically advanced?
So we have a team of consultants that are working with the Postal Service today, and I would be happy to get back to you with some of the recommendations that they've offered.
That would be great. Thank you. Dr. DeRuggi, quick question, because I'm a firm believer that government shouldn't be in the business of business, that essential government functions are what government should provide, and that we don't need to not only be a competitor in the market, but also be the regulator of that same market. So I've got some concerns that I think run deep with your philosophies in your report. But I want to talk to you specifically about project labor agreements. Are you familiar with project labor agreements where PLAs, where any government contract that is negotiated has to be done at a prevailing wage or union wage? And in most cases, we've seen a situation where non-union contractors don't get the contract because they're not capable of paying the union wages, and therefore you're seeing union jobs being let out when competitively it may be better to go to the lowest bidder. Do you have any comments on that? Have you had any experience in working with project labor agreements?
No, I have not.
Mr. Frakes, how about you?
No.
Okay.
But I think that it's something that obviously is crowding out the market and something that would be a good thing to investigate.
One last thing, back to Mr. Dodaro. You talk about the excess of real property that we have. Do you have any recommendations for liquidation of those or leasing of those to at least enhance the revenue side of the budget, the U.S. budget?
Not facility by facility. We think the agencies need to do that. We've pushed OMB to come up with a plan. Also, there's rules in the budget process that complicate the lease versus buy decision, which we've recommended that those be dealt with as well. You know, we think this is basically a management responsibility to decide that, but it should be done. And that's
wasted resource.
Yes, definitely.
Thank you. I see my time's up.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Tierney, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, well, thank the members of the panel very much for your testimony here today. You know, this committee has conducted a lot of oversight about the Department of Defense's contingency contracting, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, including the use of private security contractors, but not exclusively them, of course. Last year, in fact, when I was chairing the subcommittee on national security and foreign policy, we uncovered evidence of trucking contractors who were paying warlords and insurgents billions of dollars for so-called protection. And we also talked another contract where $3 billion in fuel contracts were going to companies that the State Department and the Department of Defense knew nothing about. So my question to you, Service Dodaro, is, you know, do you think that we have to have some improvements in the contracting laws that will provide those authorities that may be necessary to meet the challenges for operating in contingency conflicts?
I definitely think there are lessons learned that need to be applied both in potentially in law, but also in practice, and that there's a lot of lessons learned about putting this type of responsibility in a theater without appropriate training and support that needs to be done to adequately oversee it. So yes, I agree with you that there's probably lessons learned, and we can provide some of our thoughts on that to you.
That would be excellent if you would. We'd appreciate that. You know, also, with particular concern on the private security contractors, you know, there's been a real persistent problem with how they're managed in both of those areas, Iraq and Afghanistan, of course. And last year, CENTCOM got a task force together to figure out how many private security contractors they actually employed in Afghanistan, and a number came into tens of thousands on that. In Iraq, the State Department is about to take on a lot of the responsibilities from the Department of Defense, and they're hiring additional private security contractors on that. So how much confidence should we have that as DOD transitions to the State Department in this area, that they're going to be able to oversee effectively all of those thousands of private security contractors that they're bringing on?
Well, that's an area that I think needs some focus. I believe we have work underway in that area to assess that, and be happy to provide a briefing to you.
Okay. How far along are you in that work, sir?
I'm not early on.
Well, it's a pretty immediate situation,
Yeah, right.
so I hope we're going to expedite that a bit and be able to move that forward, because we've had hearings on that regularly throughout, and we never seem to be getting too far along on examining, and I say we, I'm not meaning your agency,
right.
but State Department and the Department of Defense
Right.
talk about it. They know there's a problem, but we're not really there yet. Your work could be very helpful on that. The other problem that we have, of course, is we don't seem to have enough people to really oversee those contractors that we do put it out to, and that's been a real serious problem in USAID, the State Department, and other places on that. The Wartime Contracting Commission that Jim Leach and I had the legislation on, they finally got out and started doing their job. They found out that we were hiring private contractors to oversee other private contractors on that. So how do you assess the Department of Defense's progress in insourcing those critical roles of oversight and management of contracts?
Yeah, our assessment is the contracting decisions are made much too often on an ad hoc basis. There really isn't a systematic assessment of what should be contracted out, what should be insourced, and for what should be insourced, how you build your capabilities and your staffing and expertise to be able to do that. What expertise do you need to oversee the contractor? So we've encouraged and recommended systematic assessments of that. That's the only way you can deal with that issue over time.
Yeah, well, we have some serious issues. As we started to analyze that, do you have any ideas for how they might ramp that up and separate those out so that those inherently governmental functions of oversight of contractors can actually be brought back in or insourced? Is there an impediment that exists that you can recognize and do something about, or do you think that this analysis is going to have to just wind its way out before we really get some effective recourse?
Well, I think it all has to start with, you know, what mission do you want to really achieve there, and what's the best way to be able to do it. I don't think there's going to be a magic solution to that there's going to be a set of rules on this and that, particularly when you get into environments. When you're in contingency operations and planning, you need to have something that's a little bit more robust as a foundation, but then you need to be able to allow some flexibility to be put in place. But you have to have proper oversight over it, Congressman, and that's where I think things break down.
Well, we even saw it on the Blue Water program with the Coast Guard, you know, where they had large, you know, ships being made or like that. We had a contractor out there doing the different components. Then we had a contractor analyzing the job. We had them managing the job. We had them overseeing the job. And then when the job got all messed up, we almost hired the same people to come in and assess how we could fix it.
Yeah, no, the government needs, for those areas that you know you're going to contract out, you need the proper people to oversee it that are government employees to be able to make sure you got the duty of loyalty and you have the expertise and continuity to oversee it in the best interest of the government and the taxpayer.
So getting a grip on not outsourcing jobs that shouldn't be outsourced, and the ones that should be outsourced, making sure we can manage them properly, I agree with you, is a serious issue for us.
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to the panel for being here. It has been enlightening, at least the portions that I've been in. I wish I could have been here for the entire time. Mr. Dodaro, in your written testimony, you state that excess or underutilized buildings cost over $1.6 billion annually to operate. I guess the question I would flow from Mr. Ross's earlier was what has prevented the Federal Government from doing something that makes so much sense, such as selling the properties. You stated that you wouldn't pick the properties, but what's kept us from doing that?
There are certain barriers that we've recommended that OMB focus on. For example, there are a lot of stakeholder interest in some of these buildings and properties that need to be dealt with to be able to do it. There's some legal requirements that are in place, but none of these barriers are insurmountable. And our point is that you need to aggressively identify them. They're different for each property, as you might imagine, but they need to be dealt with on a more concerted, aggressive basis.
What's the hesitancy toward this aggressive action?
Yeah,
from your perspective?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I'm not quite sure, other than it takes a lot of hard work and effort to be able to go forward on these initiatives. We've been pushing for plans to be developed to be able to do that. We're pleased they're getting better data, and they're also, on what the situation's like, but actually, implementing a lot of these things appears to be more difficult. To be honest with you, I'm not quite sure exactly what the reason is.
Any concern about any impropriety in stakeholder issues that go beyond simply dragging feet or arguments that we don't have the resources or time or energy? I mean, is there anything that would go beyond that to something?
Yeah, there's nothing. I'll go back and check with our team, make sure that my answer is correct on this, and if there are any things of that nature, we'll provide them to you. But in some cases, like for example, there are some historic preservation issues that need to be dealt with some of these buildings, and other legal concerns. But I'll provide a listing to you of some of the barriers, and also if there are any improprieties, we will certainly let you know.
Okay, thank you. Dr. DeRougy, I'm tempted to just say my question is, how would you expand on your statement already? But I won't do that. Maybe the question will allow that to take place. I appreciate what you had to say. In your written submission, you identify 3 areas of Federal spending that should be addressed, 1 being Federal spending on functions that should be reserved for the States, 2, Federal spending on functions that should be reserved for the private sector, and 3, Federal spending on items or services that government has no business purchasing in the first place. I'd like to focus my question mostly on this first area. It's apparent that you strongly believe in the 10th Amendment reserving powers to the States, not enumerated to the Federal Government.
I do.
Then do you believe a reevaluation and likely a limitation of the grants the Federal Government makes is the best way to reorganize Federal priorities, or does Congress need to do something more explicit, and if so, what is it?
I mean, I can't talk to the legal aspect because I'm not a lawyer, I'm an economist, and so I will go to the money. I really do think that restructuring the money that goes to the States, either by cutting it off or actually turning a lot of it into block grants instead of matching grants, which induce inefficiency, promotes overspending, and it would be a good way to do it. First, it would allow states to kind of have time to think about how they're going to be providing this service. And one of the problems with the matching system that we have now, above the fact, on top of the fact that it induces overspending, as I've said, is the fact that it's a one-size-fits-all type of thing. When you have a grant from the Federal Government, it also comes with strings attached and things that you have to do in a certain way, and that doesn't take under consideration, the specificity of the state. So that would be like the first step. I would either, cut a lot of this money off or turn the rest into block grants.
So cutting it off, you're not concerned that the job can't be done then? I say that facetiously.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's like there's always this understanding that this belief that if the Federal Government doesn't do it, it won't happen, but it's just not true. And the states are already, for instance, education. I mean, most of the spending already comes from the states, and it is a state function or a private sector function. And if the states don't get this money, then they will be thinking about what they actually truly need to do. And maybe a lot of these functions that they are providing right now, they should turn to the private sector. So no, I'm not concerned.
Thank you very much.
I thank the gentleman. We now recognize the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dodaro, I'd like to ask you a question that is, I'm sure, perplexed members of this committee and certainly the public. It has to do with very large, sometimes huge contractors whose abuses or poor performance is so severe that they are brought before this committee or there are headlines on them. And I want to know, I want to describe the response of federal agencies in awarding them contracts again. For example, if you did the functional equivalent of what some of these contractors have done as a employee, you'd be out the door and nobody would ever hire you again in the field, it would seem. But let me give you a couple of examples. KBR, doing work in Iraq for the Department of Defense, is so faulty on the maintenance of electrical equipment that deaths resulted, including dozens of deaths of American soldiers. But DOD then awards KBR a $2.8 billion contract to provide support services, additional support services for our troops in Iraq. Or let's take the most notorious, perhaps, Blackwater and private security, because that's been a headliner. They still have major, the State Department, after those headlines, awarded them contracts for protective services in Afghanistan. Now, these people were seen as having themselves committed, perhaps, or at least accused of committing what would amount to, in prosecution, crimes while they are doing their work. Does DOD and in the case of Blackwater give contracts again to such companies because of the difficulty of startup? Is it too wasteful? This is, after all, a competitive process. Why in the world, if a contractor has exposed the agency to such embarrassment and infamy, would the agency want to give that contractor, again, there must be some inherent reason for doing so?
Yeah. Typically, what we find when there's a lack of competition, there are either reasons for expediency. They need to move very quickly in an area. They need to have people who have the proper background, security clearances, that type of thing, or there's limited numbers of companies that could provide that service. But what we've focused on is making sure there is more competition in the process. It's a better value to the government. There needs to be adequate consideration of past contractor performance in the process. There are safeguards built into the process through suspension and debarment that need to be put into place and then followed adequately through the process. So
is suspension and debarment used?
It's used, but I think our work has shown that it's not always properly checked before some of the awards are made on a cross-government kind of basis. But
is there a way to structure the contract up front, for example, so that if wastes and such as or worse, failure to maintain the electrical system in Iraq occurs, somehow you owe the government rather than the government continuing to owe you?
Well, you definitely need to have provisions in there to protect the government from non-performance on the contractors.
What kind of provisions protect them now?
I'd have to go back and look and to provide some explanations. What we did find, though, and this is being addressed, is that many times there are incentive awards and fees there that contractors were being paid the incentive fee and really weren't meeting the standards of performance as what you would think they should be. But I'll go back, I'll provide to you and this committee the standard provisions that are in there.
It does seem to me that a system of rewards, I love incentives, frankly, of rewards and penalties, carrots and sticks, have always been thought to work. Thank you very much.
Yeah, just for the record, we are doing work currently on suspension and debarment practices, which we'll be happy to share with this committee as that work is being completed, and that we will provide you the Federal acquisition regulations that protect the government.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady. We now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Gowdy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is impossible for me to explain to the folks I work for, and I suspect most of my colleagues would have similar difficulty explaining to the people we work for the pervasiveness and longevity of government waste, fraud, and abuse. And I commend you for gathering with us today to seek solutions, and I want to start with the one that I find most compelling, which would be criminal consequences. Do you have an estimate, and I'll throw this open to all four of you, an estimate, negligence, gross negligence, criminal negligence? Where is the preponderance of the waste, fraud, and abuse? Where does it fall in that paradigm? Not all at once.
I can tell you from the Medicare and Medicaid side, a lot of what happens in terms of the prosecution of fraudulent claims within CMS, unfortunately, does not occur until it meets a certain threshold of money. So a lot of these claims.
Whose threshold is that?
I'm sorry?
Who sets the threshold?
It's within CMS, and they're the ones who determine, based on their allocation of resources, what claims that they can go after.
Well, let me ask you about the allocation of resources, because if my numbers are correct, there are almost 50 different investigative agencies, in quotes, that are seeking waste, fraud, and abuse just within health care. That alone is an example of waste and fraud and abuse. 50 different agencies?
And a huge irony that exists within that, and it's an excellent point, is that there is waste that's going on between all those organizations, in the sense that there's a lack of data sharing that's going on between them. So for instance, even within, let's say, Medicare Part A and Part D, you are missing data sharing between those two that they would be able to use to identify who potential crooks are. And so as a result, they're losing out on being able to cross-reference these individuals, and some of these people might actually be claiming to be legitimate suppliers for Medicare Part A when they were already identified as a potential fraudulent supplier for Part D. And so that lack of interaction, that lack of sharing, is leading to a lot of the negligence that you're speaking of.
Well, it's also inexplicable. It is impossible to understand, to explain to anybody outside this zip code, how you can have that. And with respect to the question asked by my colleague from the District of Columbia about carrots and sticks, I prefer the sticks. So tell me what is being done with respect to criminal prosecution, consequences, to ameliorate what has been, if my numbers are accurate, a 2-decade-long acknowledged problem. How many investigations have been started? How many matters? How many declinations by the U.S. Attorney's Office?
We can provide that information to you for the record. There are reports that the Inspector General has put out that show the matters referred, how many have been investigated, and the prosecutions that have been prosecuted as well. So we can provide that information to you. And the thresholds typically are set by the Justice Department in terms of how much monitoring money would have to be, sort of broached before they would feel it would be efficient and productive to go through the judicial system in that process. But those figures are available. We will provide them to you.
Okay. Thank you. I would yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Would the gentleman yield for just
a
moment? In the case of the question of prosecution, is the biggest problem the lack of prosecution from your studies, or is it the lack of catching in real time these individuals before the money is taken? Which do you think leads to more of the long-term abuse? The fact that people can continue stealing again and again in various ways, or the fact that we don't prosecute them at a low enough level?
While we haven't studied that issue directly, Mr. Chairman, I think part of the issue is that it's not that you can continue to abuse the system with low potential gain caught. So I think that just intuitively, just to tell you from that standpoint, I'll be happy. I'll go back and take a look and see if we have a more definitive
Okay,
answer.
and one follow-up question on an earlier one. Wouldn't it be impossible for the government to contract directly with everyone, meaning at some point the government does have to rely on general contractors to do jobs, thus it's inevitable that you will have a contractor hiring other contractors?
Yeah, as long as it's in a typical prime contract, subcontractor mode, I think that's fine. But when the government contracts out its responsibility to oversee the prime contract, then I think you have an issue.
Which we all agree with. We now recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Spear, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased with this hearing and frankly think that if we spent the rest of this year just dealing with the issues that were raised here and actually got some results, we would have done our job. I have much frustration with the fact that we hold hearings, we uncover problems, and then nothing happens. To you, Comptroller, congratulations on your official appointment. You have a high-risk list. There are agencies that stay on this high-risk list year after year with no penalties, no results, no changes. And I think that that is inexcusable. And if you need to have more authority to force these agencies to do what you recommend, then we should introduce legislation to make sure that that happens, because we look foolish, and the American people look at us as if we are totally ineffective when we cannot deliver once we have uncovered a problem. Let me move on to an area that you just editorialized in the New York Times about just 2 days ago. A percentage of the proceeds from gas and oil companies that drill on Federal lands are supposed to be paid. And evidently, according to a report, there's substantial funds that could be generated, some $9 billion in fiscal year 2009. But it appears that it is on your high-risk list in part because the oil and gas companies aren't paying their proper share. So I guess my question is, how long have they been underreporting? Why do we allow them to underreport? Why aren't the taxpayers getting the proper payments that they should be receiving, because the drilling is going on Federal lands?
Basically, I had agreed as a result of an earlier question to go back and provide a listing of the underreporting point. What I would say, though, there are really a couple issues. One, there's too much reliance on self-reported data that needs to be checked. Secondly, we found problems with the verification process that the Interior Department is supposed to use to make sure that the production figures are correct as well.
Wait a minute, excuse me. Are you telling me that the oil and gas companies are self-reporting and we're supposed to trust them?
Well, there's supposed to be checks that are put in place as well.
By whom?
By the Interior Department.
And are they?
Well, that's what we found some gaps in that, and also the verification of the production numbers, which are things that we believe need to be addressed, and that's one of the reasons we're highlighting this as a high-risk area. The other reason is that the Federal Government's basic system to assess what the cost would be for Federal leasing hasn't been revisited for 25 years. And that when the Federal Government's, what it charges for leasing on Federal lands is compared to what's charged in other countries or even some states, it ranks extremely low in its charges to begin with.
Mr. Chairman, I would recommend that we have a hearing specifically on this issue. The taxpayers deserve to get fair market value for the leases that they provide to anyone, be they the next-door neighbor or an oil and gas company. And I think we should be getting what's justifiably ours. We're the stewards of the taxpayers' money, and I think this is a ripe area. I'd like to move very quickly to the Alaska Native Corporation. I don't know if you've looked into it. If you have not, I would request through the committee that you do so. The Washington Post did a piece on November 26th, which is astonishing to me. Anytime you allow for sole contracts, sole source contracts, there is mischief that's going to take place. And in this case, evidently, a contract for $250 million was offered to a subsidiary of the Alaska Native Corporation, a gentleman living in Delaware. His office was his colonial 4-bedroom home, and he was providing sexual assault and harassment training, except he had no experience doing that, and his last contract with the government was for $73,000, and it was for janitorial services. There's been $29 billion provided to the ANC over the last decade, most of the money not going to the natives, most of them going to the non-natives. It is an absolute abuse of the program, and I think we should look into that as well.
Yeah, we've issued reports in the past on that with recommendations. We're currently looking at it again, and we'd be happy to share.
Okay, but that's my problem. You issue reports, nothing happens, and then there's another story written because we haven't done anything about it. I want to be part of a committee this year that actually delivers on results, not just have a bunch of hearings, but show that we are saving the American taxpayers' money, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chairman Issa had to go to the floor, several amendments that he's dealing with, so honored to step in as the chair. And I am up in the order, so it's good timing. So I will yield myself the 5 minutes. First, I want to thank each of you for your testimony and your work on these important issues. As the gentlelady just said, we could spend the rest of this session just on what you're sharing with us and still not get everything done that we need to as doing good oversight. But Chairman Issa has made a priority of just this, oversight of how the Federal Government is handling the people's money, and we're glad to have you here. While I thank all of you, General Dodaro, I especially want to thank you. I believe this is your first time testifying before this committee as the newly sworn-in Comptroller General. Our congratulations on your confirmation and your 30-plus years of service at GAO. That brings great leadership to the agency with that experience. And I'm going to start with you, and one is a thank you for your flexibility in our subcommittee hearing dealing with the consolidated financial reports that we've moved back to March 9th. Look forward to hearing your testimony then, and also to your upcoming report, I believe March 1st, on duplicative Federal programs. We're anxious to see that, and I know this is a first-time report, although you've addressed some of those issues in other ways in the past. And as Chair of the Subcommittee on Organization, Efficiency, and Financial Management, we look forward very much to working with you and your staff because when we think of efficiency, well, duplication of effort certainly is not an efficient use of the taxpayers' funds. So is there anything you want to give us a primer on what we may see, or should we wait till March 1st?
Well, I think, we were charged with doing an annual report. So this will be our first annual report on this. It will basically summarize the work that we've done and new work we've started since the requirement is put in place. We focused a lot on discretionary spending programs in this first area, both civilian and defense. We think it's important for defense to be on the table as well, and so you'll see a number of issues on that. In subsequent years, we're going to focus on mandatory spending and also tax expenditures as well. So we've got this on a 3-year cycle to cover the entire Federal Government. This first report will identify 34 different areas that touch hundreds of programs in virtually every major mission and agency in the Federal Government. I think you'll find it plenty of opportunities to delve into some of these issues very well. You also find that there are some limitations on the ability of us to give definitive answers to the questions about how much money you'll actually save if you consolidate this because of limitations on information that's collected on a reliable basis, from the agencies as well. We're adding to that another 50 items of cost savings opportunities beyond the overlap and duplication and revenue enhancements that could be where additional revenue could be brought into the Federal Government to help close what's now an estimated $290 billion tax gap. So both revenue-generating enhancements and cost savings opportunities. So we're looking forward to unveiling the report and providing appropriate follow-up support to the Congress.
Well, and hopefully, given the timing as we are debating the new CR today, and that's still going to be an ongoing dialogue between us and the Senate, no matter what we pass today or tomorrow, this may give us some additional information as we try to really look at how to be most efficient with the taxpayer funds, even in the immediate term in this current year. When you look at discretionary, I do agree that you need to look at everything, including DOD, and the duplication of efforts. I assume it's more duplication of programs, but not items such as the ongoing debate on the duplication of whether we have one or two engines on the Joint Strike Fighter. I assume that's outside of the realm of this report.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. I'm going to run out of time here quick. One I'd add on the oil and gas royalty, and I apologize because of trying to multitask here if you already answered this. Is there even a rough estimate, when we see $9 billion is I think in 2009 from these royalties, if they're off by even 10%, that's almost $1 billion, $900 million. Is there an estimate of what you think may be lost because of the lack of good material, of material weaknesses in their structure?
Yeah, we do not have an estimate at this time.
Okay. And one final quick comment is looked forward to getting into on the financial management at DOD. When we look at discretionary spending, there's no bigger entity than DOD, and if they can't manage their finances, I mean, we know they're the best in the world at defending us and winning wars, but as I know from my previous chairmanship of the subcommittee, their financial management leaves a lot to be desired, so we look forward to working with you on that.
Yeah, I do as well. And I look forward to the upcoming hearing on the financial audits and to working with you in the subcommittee chair capacity.
Thank you. And we now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman, Mr. McHenry from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here. I know it's been a long morning with votes. They haven't sort of agreed with our schedule here, but Dr. DeRougy, in your previous answer to Mr. Walberg and in your testimony, you talk about the Flypaper Effect, the fact that these Federal transfers with matching grants at the State and local level actually increases spending and over the long term increases taxation. This is particularly interesting in light of the stimulus, which we had $150 billion roughly that was in direct Federal transfers to States and thereby increasing spending. So, the question is the Federal government really complicit in the State and municipal government's financial woes by these operations?
Yes, it is. I mean,
will you elaborate? I mean,
there's a big economic literature that actually documents this problem, and yet, the system goes on. One of the things that people always bemoan is the fact that if we cut Federal spending going to the States are going to end up with big holes. But this always rests on this assumption that the Federal government has deep pockets, and it's not the case. For every dollar that the Federal government spends, whether it's on the States, on the private sector, it has to tax people, taxpayers who live in those 50 States. And also it has to borrow money. So the more the Federal government does, and this is how it works, and sends money to the States, right, because it can borrow also this money, it actually pushes the Federal government towards a more irresponsible behavior of borrowing and debt.
So in my subcommittee on this committee, we've had discussions about the muni and state bond issue, the lack of real transparency there.
But there's another issue there, right? I mean, is the fact that the Federal government has actually been complicit in granting special treatment to investors who think it's a really good idea to lend money to bankrupt city in the form of tax deductions and, Build America bond, where the Federal government subsidize lending money, the rates to lend money to bankrupt cities, that's complicit.
Absolutely. Okay. So in terms of this, do you think that the State and municipal financial position is worse than currently known?
Yes, I think it is. If you take the economic approach of actually valuing the pension unfunded liability instead of the less than $500 billion that state pensions have on their book, you come up with a number of at least $3 trillion. So yes, the fiscal pictures in the states is much worse than we think.
Okay. And in terms of, well, here's a separate question. I don't know if you'd want to answer it, but in terms of our ability to know, or your ability when you're doing research to see the long-range unfunded liabilities of states, municipalities, even the federal government, is it knowable for the average taxpayer to see where their city or state is in terms of financial liabilities over the long range?
I think it's very important. I mean, not everyone might want to look at it, but I can tell you, I find that it's way easier to look for data at the federal level. I find it extremely complicated to look at data at the state level and municipal level. And more importantly, there are a lot of accounting standards that apply only to the government that are very different from the accounting standards that apply to the private sector, that makes the size of liability of the federal government, state and municipal governments much smaller than it actually is. And it would be a very good thing not only to make these this data transparent, but also to value it at its actual present value, and so we can see what the true size of this liability is.
Okay, so this is GASB versus FASB, in essence, to speak the lingo. But basically, the private sector has to value things differently than governments value things based on accounting standards.
Yes.
So you see some flaw with government accounting standards.
There are real flaws with accounting standards. I mean, and it all points in one direction, as making the size of the liability and what taxpayers ultimately will have to pay and the bill they'll have to burden look way smaller, and that's a real problem.
So FASB standards would give you greater transparency and a better ability to understand the true nature of the liability.
Yes, and also like value the liability in the future at its present value, so you know actually what you're going to have to pay in the future and what you need to actually put down right now with actual realistic rate of return rather than completely optimistic 8% rate of return.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, gentlemen. Just to follow on that real quick is I think you're talking a little bit about accrual method of a more accurate, having the federal government be fully disclosing. So when we talk about our $14 trillion of debt, if we add in all of our unfunded liabilities on Medicare and Medicaid, we're really in the $50 to $60 trillion.
Actually, it's currently on the financial accounting, the financial statement of the United States unfunded liability reached almost $80 trillion.
Right. If you add, right, exactly. And that's where really is not well focused on, because we focus on the publicly held debt, which is just a small fraction of that whole cost.
And one of the things also we don't talk very much about is the fact that the intragovernmental debt, which is supposed to be actually the already funded part of the promise that we've made to seniors, actually this money is gone. It is true that there are IOUs in those trust funds, but the only way the IOU are going to be cashed and paid back to these programs is if the federal government either tax people or borrow more money.
Yep. Thank you. We thank each of you again for your testimony and the great resources you've provided today and what we know you'll continue to do. And as a committee, we look forward to continuing to partner with you. So, thank you. And we're going to move to our third panel then. If our witnesses want to work their way towards the witness table.